Hello, and welcome to the Power of 10 Forum series hosted by Cumberland Region Tomorrow. I am Erin Hafkinshiel, Executive Director of Mobility and Transportation at Vanderbilt University. I oversee Vanderbilt's MoveVU program. By way of introduction, I wanted to share a little bit about our program and why the issue of creating safer streets is so important to us. MoveVU aims to shift our commute mode share from 76.5% drive alone rate to a 55% drive alone rate by 2025. We've developed a comprehensive strategic plan to help us reach our goals. But in addition to setting an ambitious target, it really comes down to two main strategies: improving our built environment and infrastructure to encourage more sustainable commute modes, including upgrading our greenways across campus, pedestrianizing streets, building a walk and roll loop around the perimeter of our campus, and investing in state-of-the-art sensors so that we can track our progress over time. And second, setting programs and policies that even the playing field for walking, biking, and transit, such as shifting our parking permits from an annual pass to a daily parking charge, financially incentivizing sustainable commute trips, and providing a commute app to help commuters make daily commute decisions and track their trips. Today's panel focuses on how we can improve our built environment to make our streets safer for our most vulnerable road users. Vanderbilt has long focused on improving safety on our roads internal to campus. In addition to some of the larger infrastructure projects I mentioned, we've also lowered speed limits, improved traffic signal timings, and enhanced crosswalks. This has resulted in a reduction in traffic accidents involving pedestrians internal to campus. But it's become increasingly clear, particularly over the last year, that we need to focus outside our perimeter as well. Last summer, one of our graduate students was hit and killed while in the crosswalk crossing West End Avenue at 31st Avenue. She was doing everything right, and still the streets were not safe enough for her. We must do better and not accept these deaths as inevitable. Our undergraduate students have also become more aware of this issue over this past year because over 2,500 of them had to live off campus due to social distancing requirements. For many of them, they had to cross West End Avenue on a daily basis to get to campus for the first time during their time at Vanderbilt. And it became increasingly clear to them that that pedestrian safety is a really dire issue, and that we need to that there's a lot of change that needs to happen to make progress. Before we dive in, a little housekeeping. First, we must thank KCI Technologies for their generous support of today's session. KCI and Bob Murphy in particular have played a pivotal role in transforming our streets here in Nashville. We are grateful for his leadership. Now let's take a look at your dashboard and its features. On the right side of your screen, you will find the chat and Q&A tabs. Use the Q&A tab to submit your questions to the panel. If you have an interest in a question already entered, click the upvote button. This will make it rise in priority. You can view the broadcast in full screen mode by closing the chat and Q&A by clicking in the down arrow in the upper right-hand corner of each feature. You can reopen them if you elect to do so in the broadcast later by clicking on the chat icon, and it will open all features. Now that you understand how the platform works, let's dive in. We have a great panel today. First is Angie Henderson, a Metro Councilwoman. Next is Bill McCord, a planner from the City of Gallatin. Robbie Hayes, Senior Project Manager at HNTB. And Nora Kern, Executive Director of Walk Bike Nashville. To kick us off, we're going to start with Councilwoman Angie Henderson. Angie, you've been working on pedestrian safety issues for a long time. Tell us a little bit about why this issue is so important to you and where you think the barriers are for making more scalable progress.
Thanks, Erin. I'm glad to be here. So I'm a native Nashvilleian, and I had the good fortune to kind of travel a lot and live in some other cities. And when I moved back to Nashville a little over 20 years ago, I was pretty disconcerted, having lived in several walkable communities, from San Francisco to a teeny town in Vermont, really how far behind we were as a city. And so I got involved. I volunteered with Walk Bike Nashville. I used to host, Walk to Lunch events, Walk Nashville Week events. Now we have Walk Nashville Month. As I just engaged in my community, I was wanting to see Nashville to be more walkable. And so, I did some kind of volunteer advocacy as my children were getting older. Obviously, as either, a mom with a stroller, you become really mindful, as I'm sure you know, Erin, about ADA accessibility. And so a lot of my volunteer work focused in the Green Hills Commercial District with a group called the Green Hills Action Partners. And so we were working with Metro, Public Works, our council member, trying to advocate for little pieces here and there. And I think it was good work, but it became clear to me that we were going to have to change some policy. That we were decades and decades behind. We had not required sidewalks in a lot of places. And so I ran for office primarily with that in mind, on a Safe Streets platform to address our sidewalk policy. And so I think, it's something that I'm hearing from my constituents, and I'm in a more kind of suburban area, kind of transitional, like the Green Hills Business District, the Green Hills area. And my district goes all the way out to Bellevue. Highway 100, Old Hickory Boulevard, 70 South, state routes. So we have satellite cities, state routes, local roads. And so I've really been working in this space and serving on our Public Works Committee for the past 5 years. So I'm really interested in the policy piece and also the funding for it. I think, Erin, you had asked about kind of the barriers to scalable progress, I think.
Yeah.
And so, I would say that, the policy expansion that we did particular to sidewalk requirements, that was a pretty heavy lift. Doing policy in Nashville that works for 530 some odd square miles of a lot of different contexts. Again, state routes, satellite cities, general services district, urban, rural, old city of Nashville where sidewalks were required, suburban areas where they weren't. It is challenging to implement policy that works for all those areas. And so, we've really just expanded that policy and elevated our requirements and our standards within the last. That policy became effective in 2017. You were mostly seeing sidewalks come through specific plan development. You were seeing them internal to communities in our subdivision regs. And so really trying to scale it up to a countywide level, I really think the policy is key, because what we were doing was on a kind of piecemeal, subdivision, this development, and trying to build out a network in reverse is pretty challenging. And the cost issue is one of the issues for scale, again, because we're working backwards. If we had requirements in place to start, it would have cost less than now to go back, because every sidewalk is also a stormwater project. And so the funding is key. And then I think just fine tuning the policy. So we've expanded our requirements. We've elevated them and expanded them where they're applicable. We've just added the requirement for another policy, advanced street trees in our Nashville Next centers. And so with every new policy that you implement, whether geographically based within our strategic plan or at a countywide level, you kind of have to give it a few years to see what the implementation is. And what do we learn from the implementation? What staffing do we need to implement it? What are we hearing back from the development community? And then you fine tune the legislation, and then you fine tune it some more, then you try to scale it some more. So it's somewhat of an iterative process, but I think we have taken some big steps as a city, both on the funding side and the policy side. We have a very long way to go, but as in all things, I think it's policy and funding.
Thank you, Angie. Yes, one of the data points that I always love to share, which we found out during the last update to the walk and bike plan, is that our sidewalk deficit is so big, it would cost us $10 billion to address it across the county, which was bigger than even the transit plan we were considering. So I know we're going to come back to these issues of sidewalk policy and costs, Angie, when we get into the discussion. Nora, I wanted to turn to you. Pedestrian safety is an increasingly hot topic, and there is general acceptance that we need to make our streets safer. No one would argue that we don't want our streets to be safe. And yet our pedestrian fatality numbers here in Nashville are actually rising, and pretty significantly, almost doubling. Tell us a little bit about the work that Walk Bike Nashville is doing to improve pedestrian safety and why we are still seeing fatalities on the rise.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. And it's great to be here with everybody. So yeah, I've been at Walk Bike Nashville almost 8 years, and throughout that time, I think pedestrian fatalities have risen every year except for one. And last year was the most deadly year in the history of our city. We lost 39 people walking on our streets. And so, over the last, my time at Walk Bike Nashville, pedestrian safety, I would say, has really become one of our primary focuses. And I think two things, or maybe two related things, have really emerged that I think we need to address more seriously as a city. And the first one to add to Angie's, policy and funding, I think is also a question of priorities. And I think there are a lot of people certainly who see pedestrian safety as a really important issue. But the challenge we have is most of our pedestrian crashes, 80+%, are happening on a really handful of streets. So, and they're all the same type of streets. There are state arterial roads, Murfreesboro Pike, Dickerson Pike, Gallatin Pike, West End Avenue, Charlotte Avenue. These streets all look more or less the same. And the problem is right now we have two competing priorities on those streets. On the one hand, they were designed to move 30,000 cars a day as quickly as possible from downtown to the surrounding counties. And that kind of continues to be a priority. So they have many lanes and few crossings and, are designed so that people can travel quickly. On the other hand, we've now, based on our Nashville Next Master Plan, are developing and have long developed our pikes as the centers of our community. So we have housing, we have bus stops are based on our pikes system. We have schools, we have churches, we have everything that we live and need in our community are now on our pikes. And so you have people going to school, walking to the bus stop, and they're doing so on streets that were designed for cars to move quickly. And those two goals cannot entirely coexist. And so I think we need to really have some hard conversations about what is the priority on, for example, a West End Avenue where it goes through Vanderbilt. Can we realize that maybe the priority for part of that needs to be letting people move around on foot, cross the street, get to the parks, get to the stores, ride the bus. And that might mean that we need to look at adding more crossings, reducing slip lanes and turning, right turn lanes, adding no turn on reds, reducing the speed limit and designing the street for a slower speed. And I think those are some really tough conversations, even though in principle, we all really want to have safer streets. And I think that's where we're heading. So I'm really excited about a lot of the conversations that are happening to really start to tackle some of those difficult conversations about those two competing priorities. And I think that the second point I'll just add, which we see is really complementary, and I think it's really important that we start to hear from the voices of people who are walking in our city and people who've lost loved ones. And so we formed a chapter of Families for Safe Streets, which is a network of groups around the country that support and advocate for people who've lost loved ones in traffic crashes. And very often their stories aren't heard. We don't hear from the bus rider who's trying to cross Murfreesboro Pike every day in the evening to get to her bus stop. We don't hear from the student at Schwab Elementary who needs to cross Dickerson Pike where there are no sidewalks and very few streetlights and there's a ditch on the side of the road. And so I think that's, in order to shift the priorities, we really need to start hearing more from the people who are out using our streets on foot. So
Thank you, Nora. That is such a great way to describe the issue that we're having, because I think that we've seen that around Vanderbilt. So, we're hemmed in by 21st Avenue and West End that for so long have been seen as these sort of through routes into town. And yet there's just a tremendous amount of activity that's happening on those streets themselves. And we need to make them safer for walking and crossing the street. Bill, we're going to turn to you now. Some people might think that pedestrian safety issues are only important inside the urban core. And, even within Davidson County, we have more urban areas than suburban areas. But you hear from residents all the time about the need for a better bike ped system in Gallatin. Tell us what you're hearing from your residents and how you're incorporating those priorities into your new comprehensive plan.
Well, okay. Bill McCord here. I'm the city planner over in Gallatin. We don't really hear a lot from the residents. We have at our public meetings where we take public comment, and as we've been developing our comp plan, we have, but I don't get calls every day asking, nor does engineering asking for facilities. Now, they will address that with their elected officials and so forth, but we're well aware of those issues and are trying to address those. So we don't, unlike Nashville, we don't have a big downtown area, but we do have our little urban core that's scalable to our community. And we have a lot of interest in needs for walking in that area in particular, but really throughout the city as well. Most recently, the city has budgeted funds to replace some crosswalk indicators that we've essentially placed pylons in the roadway, and they've been getting run over in the downtown area, and we're going to replace those with rapid flashing pedestrian activated signals, and those will be installed in the next fiscal year, which should help not only reduce or eliminate, hopefully, damage to the treatments that we've been applying here recently, and also greatly increase visibility of pedestrians in crosswalks. So, well, I think we're getting a little better compliance with people who are approaching crosswalks that are marked even now, even though may not be signal activated. And so that's helping out a little bit. And the more people have been walking, of course, with COVID. People are trying to get out and find some way to socialize in a different type of way, and perhaps get exercise as well, but also to commit for some of those trips. One of the issues that we're working here in Sumner County, and I think I mentioned before, is that we were recipients of a grant from TDOT to do a countywide active bike ped plan, active transportation plan, and that will be kicking off here real soon. We haven't received a notice to proceed. HNTB is actually going to be doing that on behalf of the county and TDOT. So we're going to have opportunities to involve not just the smaller towns in the county and the larger communities like Gallatin and Hendersonville, but also the rural areas. So we're going to be looking at not just pedestrian, but bicycle traffic in the urbanized areas and on existing and or non-existing facilities, and where those demand likely will occur in conjunction with the plans that have already been developed with the other cities. We have a greenways program that was identified not only in our current comp plan, but we're going to be continuing that, of course, in our updated comp plan. That's underway right now. I don't have any specific details other than what will probably carry over from our current comp plan to the next comp plan. But the city's had a requirement for new development for the most part, except for industrial areas and construction of lots in older subdivisions to ensure that new development is providing sidewalks. In addition to that, we are pursuing grant opportunities to fill a prioritized list that we developed here, 5, 6 years ago. We identified a list, and those primarily identify areas where there are no facilities and there were the gaps in the existing facilities, as well as those around high trip generators, including parks and schools. So there are a lot of places around town, just as Councilwoman Henderson mentioned, that just weren't built with sidewalks for 40 years, 50 years. And now we're trying to prioritize those and construct those as best we can, depending on the type of facility that and the roadway that those sidewalks would be constructed along. Density probably is a key, and also identifying a lot of those priorities. So as I mentioned, in downtown, of course, that's an important area, and that is probably one of our more dense areas. But we have a lot of density, including multifamily development that's occurred in more of our traditional suburban areas. So we're trying to identify the low-hanging fruit. As I mentioned before, we're trying to fill those gaps, and those obvious gaps, either having new development try to fill those gaps, or us again pursuing grants and or programming funds in our city budget to construct those missing links. And then we're also going to be evaluating our existing facilities and how they might be able to be retrofitted with relatively little investment to either identify paved shoulders that are suitable for bike lanes, and areas where we have sufficient right of way and can construct a sidewalk without having to acquire right of way. That's going to be a big impediment to implementing a lot of this, is acquiring right of way and going through that process. Other than that, I'm not sure I can speak too much on the rest of the county and their priorities. I know that we are really trying to step it up here in Gallatin from what's been done over the years. And the problem is the cost of facilities is really far outstripping our ability to meet the demand and fill those gaps. We have a couple of projects right now that are under construction, in addition to the one that I mentioned in the downtown area. And they create some, conflicts with existing modes that are predominant in those areas. And so, as was mentioned earlier, there's a lot of other things that go into eating up the cost of these pedestrian facilities, and including retrofitting drainage systems. So a lot of these projects we have to look at and find out the drainage improvements associated with them are as expensive, or maybe more expensive than the pedestrian and bike facility. So we're cognizant of that, and that kind of plays into establishing our list of priorities. So a lot of things going on here. We're developing quite rapidly, probably the fastest we've ever grown here, except for maybe the first year when the city was established many years, over 200 years ago. But we did get a lot of good feedback from our residents when we're going through the comp plan process, and we expect to have additional comments when the draft is presented to our planning commission and city council. I know that pedestrian and bicycle improvements were high and frequently mentioned, high on the list of those who did participate, and we're cognizant of that, and definitely will make that a highlight of our plan.
Thank you, Bill. My in-laws live in Gallatin, and there is a new multifamily housing development. I feel like every time we go to visit, there's a new one. So there clearly is that density that's happening. And like you said, the policy is so important, because the last thing you want is for one multifamily development to back up to another multifamily development, and yet the street grid doesn't exist, so that they have to drive from their development to see a friend in the other development, or even drive drive, less than a quarter mile to some of the commercial locations, just right outside their neighborhood. So the policy aspect of getting that development right is so critical.
Well, I hope that if they live in a area of town that's recently been constructed, that they do have pedestrian facilities constructed with that, and that they have frequent connections not only to the public sidewalk system but to other adjacent properties as well.
Yes, definitely, for sure. So speaking of policy and planning, Robbie, we're going to turn to you. As Bill mentioned, your team is helping Sumner County think through their active transportation plan. Tell us a little bit about how that process will go once you get your notice to proceed. I know how that process can drag out a little bit. And more generally, how you start this transition to more bike ped infrastructure in places where there might be less obvious demand for them.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to be here with this group. First off, I really appreciate all the comments and agree with the comments that were previously made. As Aaron mentioned, I work with HNTB, but I also sit on the board of Cumberland Region Tomorrow, which is a organization representing our 10-county Middle Tennessee region. And really our mission is to serve as a resource, partner, and advocate of quality growth and good planning principles and strategies. This is obviously one of those topic areas that we are acutely and keenly focused on. So just appreciate the opportunity to represent CRT and for everyone's participation today. So to your question, Aaron, what is that process going to look like? Well, first off, I'm really excited. This is a new grant opportunity through the Tennessee Department of Transportation, through the Urban Transportation Planning Grant. For the past several years, they've had a similar program, statewide program for rural communities that aren't necessarily within the MPO boundaries. So offering grant opportunities and improvements on a more rural scale, which is critically important. A lot of those areas lack even more funding than some of our more suburban and urban areas. So building off the success of that, TDOT acknowledged that, hey, there's also good opportunities within our MPO boundaries. And so, yes, we are going to be working with Bill and other folks within Sumner County on this active transportation plan. So, first will be kind of, hey, we're going to come to you all. We want to hear your thoughts. So, that's not just the practitioners, the experts, that's going to be all users. And I think what's important about that is what we're trying to do is empower stakeholders. And that stakeholder is a very large umbrella that we fall under. So it's the citizens, it's the active users, it's the ADA community. It's also representatives of the local governments in the cities and in the county within Sumner County. But also as exciting is involvement and support all the way the MPO, TDOT, and FHWA. So really this sort of all-inclusive conversations, I think, is going to help drive home a really important point, what seems to be made in the previous comments, which is that we really need to be looking at a mindset change here. And I'm very optimistic that we are on that right path. I think, the Middle Tennessee area is uniquely positioned due to the growth that's occurring within the region and the different mindsets and experiences that come along with that. Councilwoman Henderson spoke on her experiences in other areas, and I think we can all kind of draw from that. But it's going to be a very hands-on process for this plan. And we will go through the traditional charrette type exercises where we vision what could this be, and there's nothing off limits with that. And so as we do that, then we'll start working towards collecting and analyzing data. And I think those data-driven decisions are very critical in the success for the Sumner County Active Transportation Plan, but also other communities throughout our region. And so as we're able to collect more data and make better use of that, I think what's going to come out of that are better informed decisions that allow us to prioritize, the needs that are expressed beyond just anecdotal evidence and preferences of certain community members. So I'm very excited that you kind of blend those two opportunities together to really get to some really good decision making. So that's sort of our perspective on that. Again, I think one of the big things is, we've got to continue working on a change mindset on how we look at our transportation infrastructure and our transportation networks. It's an asset for all. It's not just for automobiles. We're talking about pedestrians. We're talking about other multimodal users. We're also talking about a transit component as well. And then also, very key is accessibility for ADA users. So, while, we've got this Sumner County example, I think we're really going to see a lot of progress being made within the region and also across the state. I know that TDOT is working on trying to make this more of a effort in their active transportation planning process through grant opportunities, which, that's a little bit reactionary, but when you start thinking about planning, you can sort of change that mindset from being just reactionary to being more proactive. And so as we build upon these plans, I think we're going to see some very quality results that come out of that.
That's great, Robbie. I have a couple questions that I'm going to dive into, but we actually have one from the audience that's very relevant to what you were just talking about, Robbie. Kim asks, I know a lot of effort goes into modeling car trips, where they're going, where they're coming from, and where they're going. And is there a similar modeling effort for pedestrian and bike trips, particularly in places where, again, you may not be seeing the demand for those trips? One of my favorite planning lines about building bike and ped infrastructure is you never decide to build a bridge based on the number of people that are swimming across the body of water, because no one's going to do that. Similar to biking and walking in really unsafe places, you can't just rely on the trips that you're already seeing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, it is admittedly difficult to, capture those counts like you would for automobiles. So, we look at certain standards, certain guidelines to help us with an estimate of that. To Bill's point, it also deals with the urban and built environment. And so you can put some factors in based on what the expected densities are. And then, also an assessment of what your existing infrastructure network looks like from a bike and pedestrian perspective. And so you can reasonably calculate, what's the existing and what the predicted future use can be. And so, there's a number of standards and factors that go into play with that. And some of those are national standards. So, we certainly want to keep mindful of that, but also understand that each project, each scenario is going to be different. So, again, that's where the local community has a strong role because they help us inform us. We can't be everywhere all the time. So, having that information from them, not necessarily a pedestrian count per se, but just sort of the context and understanding of what's going on. And so that kind of helps us with, predictive modeling on what the transportation flow will be, again, beyond just automobiles.
And Aaron, if I may I do a follow-up response to that? I love the quotation that you shared. I use that often as well. And I think, in the context of development, we have traffic impact studies and you kind of look at those. And I think we need to kind of rework how those are done, because I think what they often create is things that are not good pedestrian environments. So it's like, oh, you're building this development with a massive parking garage and this many floors. So that means you need this, extra turn lane, right? Which now, if you're within a kind of walkable center or area, that's just made it even wider to cross the road. And so I'm kind of have that in my mind that we need to get back to that in Nashville. But I think that's true. It really in any city, when you're asking a development, kind of what's that induced demand? Like, what is your development creating? And then what are you obligated to kind of do from an infrastructure perspective. And I think, what we're seeing in Nashville is, Nashville is sort of prescient in that we took out parking minimums downtown, like decades ago. And everybody's like, oh, you got to do that. But what we hear back is from the development community is the bank won't give us the funding if we don't build the parking. Right. And so it's a market demand issue. And so, what I'm hoping from a policy perspective, and, that's applicable to, Williamson County for corporate locations and increasingly for all our boundary counties is work I know that you, Aaron, have done around, transportation demand management. So, when we have a development like, say, Oracle, right, it's coming to Nashville. I'm a little concerned that it's a very suburban looking office campus right near downtown. So they're going to do a bike ped bridge. That's great. But, I bet you most of the people are going to be driving there. There's only 650 housing units approximate to Oracle at present. Councilman Parker's done some great work of making sure we've got some bike ped connections and making sure all that infrastructure. But I think we've got to kind of figure out in this pivotal boom moment. I was so glad to hear from Mr. McCord, right? When they're doing multifamily, they're having that greenway requirement, like they've got to dedicate that area compatible with their greenway master plan that, and that Mr. Hayes is going to work on. And so, getting those strategic plans are important because the plan informs the policy. That's how you layer on the requirements, right? So you can say, we're requiring these things here because it meets our strategic planning goals. But then also just sort of practically upon implementation, in development review and design and, working with these corporate relocations. So like you said, Aaron, earlier, getting Vanderbilt folks to think about the cost of driving daily and, smart parking garages, like what's the upside to you if you take transit or you bike instead, or, Amazon, I think, made a commitment to 30% walk bike to work, and getting some of those kind of key trip generators to kind of look at their impact. And then on the city side, making sure that, I think we're kind of in that middle space now where we're asking the right questions, but we're not really requiring it. And I think we need to kind of optimize our requirements. So, if you're coming and you're getting these incentives, then you're going to have to do these things. So.
Or even take it a step further and like many of our peers actually mandate that major employers put together a TDM plan. We are, as major employers, we are responsible for those trips. And so thinking through how that happens. I'm also so glad you brought up parking policy. Obviously, that's paramount to our work at Vanderbilt. We own 22,000 parking spaces, which is land that is now worth, $1.3 billion. And our occupancy rate is only 65%. So not only is it an underutilized use as parking, but we're not even utilizing it as parking. So I think parking policy is going to be paramount to all of the discussions that we're having, but nobody wants you to take away their parking spot in front of their building. So it's a tough conversation to have. So all of you mentioned, we've got some really wide range of expertise here, and all of you mentioned the critical role of policy. So I am going to ask you a little bit of a wonky policy question. The Federal Highway Administration is currently working on an update to the MUTCD, which is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And I think this is a perfect example of the sort of competing priorities that Nora talked about. The MUTCD talks a lot about obviously safety and traffic safety being a really critical priority, but they also have policies that work to improve throughput and speed on a lot of their on roadways. And I should make clear, the MUTCD is the federal guideline that guides policy and design on all of our streets all across the country. So if you were queen or king for the day, what would you change in the MUTCD? And Nora, I'm going to turn to you first.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm guessing someone else is going to mention crosswalk warrants because that's one that's a hot topic. So I'm actually going to not talk about that one. I think there's been a lot of talk about just again the question of priorities in the MUTCD and where pedestrian safety is placed. And is it, there's a big movement nationally around Vision Zero and really saying that the goal should be 0 pedestrian fatalities and that anything more than that is not an acceptable goal. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement in that respect in the MUTCD, although I'm not an engineer, so I haven't read it all. But one thing I would love to see in there is that if certain land use, transit conditions existed, that there would be a requirement to have a signalized pedestrian crossing over if there's a street more than 3 lanes wide. And so right now it's kind of, we have lots of requirements for cars and when cars are signalized. And I think, if we really want to be safe, if you have a bus stop on a 5-lane road, you should be required to have a signalized crossing with a refuge island for someone to get across the street. So I wish it was almost the reverse in that we mandated pedestrian safety first and then worked into the cars around them.
Bill, I'm going to go to you next. What would you change? And I know you're also a planner, not an engineer, but what would you change in the MUTCD? I think you might be on mute.
Sorry about that. I was muted. I think I tried to address this at our last meeting that we had, but I think I focused on the need for flexibility and that we don't need the great to be the enemy of the good. So there are a lot of opportunities for a variety of designs that are more economical than, going for the highest hanging fruit. So I think that given our limited funding, we infrastructure funding is really a hot topic now. And there's such great need because of neglect for years and years and years is that we're not going to be able to overcome that, as you mentioned, the billions of dollars of deficiencies that we have only even in Nashville alone related to bike and ped infrastructure, is that we're going to have to find ways to provide that in a reasonable manner that does not obligate us to expend more money than necessary to accomplish what we're trying to do. So there's a lot of design criteria and administrative procedures that really need to be looked at. Are they effective in getting a project completed in a reasonable amount of time with a reasonable amount of funds to accommodate the demand for a particular facility? So that's a huge burden to overcome, but those really need to be looked at. Those processes have complicated themselves over years and years and years, and some may perceive that they perfected it, and maybe they've gone beyond that.
I think that's such a good point, Bill. And it's such when you're putting together a guideline document for the whole country, it can be really hard to sort of think through all the opportunities or all of the cases that you're going to run into. So having flexibility is so critical to that. Robbie, you want to take a stab?
Sure. I agree wholeheartedly with the flexibility. So that's first and foremost. I also think that the manual itself should have more opportunities for updates. And kind of where I'm going with this is, there's a lot of new technologies that are out there, certainly since the last manual was updated. So, I would love the opportunity for this manual to be updated on a more frequent basis. Also, kind of diving into that technology, the use of that, the use of good lighting, the use of good design treatments, particularly at crosswalk areas. So, unfortunately, we have to put more of the onus on the driver to be aware of the other users, where in the past it's more of, this is the driver's road. You have to be more aware, and that's on you. And I think that's got to change. And I think the use of technologies in how we do advanced warning systems in crosswalk applications, pulling more into that so that it's more visually apparent than just a sign that's sticking along a signpost with 5 or 6 other signs that you're really not going to pay that much attention to. You're really going to have to work towards using technologies to draw more of the driver's attention until you can get that mindset change, like I was mentioning earlier, because that's really kind of the critical piece in my mind.
Thank you, Robbie. Angie?
Yeah, I think you and Robbie and Nora touched on it, because, the assumption is throughput for cars, right? And that drivers having less conflicts and less things to kind of think about. And, that's fine on a highway, right? So I've gotten on this highway where there's no conflict, there's no bikes, there's no ped. So, fine, go 55, 65, whatever you need to do where you need to get. But kind of this, as Nora highlighted for pedestrian fatalities, 80% of our fatalities in Nashville are on these state routes, and there is absolutely this kind of disconnect. So I would say, if I were queen for the day, the 85% rule, where we set speed based on how fast people are going. So like, okay, well, we made it really wide and we've got 12-foot lanes and everybody's out here blowing through, and, yeah, we got a grocery store and a bus stop and, apartment communities over here and a school over there. But, the speed limit on this road is still 45 miles an hour, so I think you're starting to see a culture shift locally. Nora has served really ably and well on our local traffic and parking commission. And I remember kind of as a Nashvilleian many years ago, starting to engage that conversation about speed limit reduction. So, Nashville has done not quite countywide, it's still our USD urban services district, but, 25 miles per hour. But even prior to that, I had already on some collector streets near schools, near a commercial district, too much support in the community, brought those speed limits down to 30. I'm about to do another pass of that. So it starts kind of the dominoes in a good way. So if you reset the baseline, right, and that still allows for certain neighborhoods where the roads are narrower and it might even work, 20 is plenty often. So, that's can be through our traffic calming process. You can kind of come back and get that lower speed. But I think when you've just sort of got that mainstream assumption that you can't reset, we've engineered the roads for people to go fast. And then we have this sort of loop where the fact that people are going fast means we can't lower the speed limit. And I think we need to kind of just break that box and reset those assumptions. So I would like to see the 85% rule just go away entirely.
Yeah, I think that speaks so much to Nora's comment about just sort of flipping the guidelines so that we actually are prioritizing our most vulnerable road users. I was just thinking about this the other day as I was walking my dog on a street with no sidewalks, that if we were really truly knowing our sidewalk deficit and how expensive it's going to be for us to build out our sidewalks, if we really were prioritizing safety, then any street in Nashville that doesn't have a sidewalk, a dedicated pedestrian infrastructure, the speed limit would be 25 or less, because we know that if a pedestrian gets hit by a car at any speed over 25, that they have a much higher chance of severe injury or death. So I'm going to turn to some some audience questions now. This one might be a little bit more towards folks working in Davidson County, but Carrie wants to know what your thoughts are on the mayor's new transportation plan, and whether you think it will make and how it will make our streets safer. Angie, do you want to start us off on that one again?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I think what I've tried to focus on, and I hope that it's good to have a plan, right? But I also think a lot of that kind of foundational programmatic work is really important. So I think what I'm looking at in Nashville, it is part of the transportation plan, but our evolution to a Department of Transportation, and the staffing that we're going to do there, so that we can do traffic calming at scale, we can do safe routes to school at scale, we can do the 20% of the pedestrian fatality, like we can fix those. What I'm really looking to see is that, we're going to staff appropriately to scale the programmatic things, like, the bikeways, the sidewalk program. I think we've just been, it's, for our city to have had, like 3 mayors in 4 years, or, whatever, it's kind of been just sort of the fits and starts and fits and starts. So I'm not necessarily like looking at that transportation plan to be the be all to end all. Like, I really want us to see just sort of the bread and butter organizational foundational work that will lay the groundwork. I think this administration is really wanting to look at opportunistic funding, grant funding. A lot of the change is kind of happening at the federal level, and getting our strategic plans aligned with our staffing and our org chart. And so, I guess that's a roundabout way to say, I'm not really looking at that transportation plan and saying, yes, this plan will deliver this. I'm just really trying to look at the kind of internal process, staffing management stuff that we have got to get done, or we're never going to be able to implement any plan. And that's so often, I think, and that's maybe interesting for Mr. McCord and Mr. Hayes, a lot of cities do a lot of planning. This strategic plan, that strategic plan, mayors change, city councils change, and commissions change, priorities change. And we don't implement the plans, right? And so I chaired the policy committee of the subcommittee of the Walk and Bike Strategic Plan. I'm looking at that plan, right? Like, that plan spoke to street trees. So, I implemented a street tree policy. Like, we've really got to use the plans that we've done. And I know, citizens and others, participating in this panel, it can be frustrating. How many times do I need to show up and say, I want sidewalks, or we want bikeways, or we want, we've got to do the work to show citizens that we've heard them, and that we're starting to implement the plan. Thanks.
Anyone else want to chime in on that question?
Well, I'll just chime in, add to that. I think, with every part of the plan, it also comes back again to priorities. I guess that's my theme of the day. So I think Carrie specifically talked about traffic management, system that the mayor is part of the transportation plan. And I think, traffic management is a great example where it can be used to just make sure all the cars on Gallatin Pike move as quickly as possible and have as low delay as possible. Or it can be used to make sure that no bus rider who's trying to cross Gallatin Pike has to wait for more than 30 seconds, and that there's not right turns on red where there's a school letting out. And so I think that's where, again, we need, as the community, to continue to be, holding our leaders and our departments accountable to make sure we follow through in those details, because each of these tools, whether it's sidewalks or traffic management, or, planning, can be used for a number of different outcomes. And it's really the final results on the street that are really going to make a difference, and what we want to hold everyone accountable to achieving.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, as planners, we never want to see a plan sit on the shelf. And I know everyone's probably heard that term before, but it's true, right? So, I think what we're starting to see a lot more of in these planning is going beyond just a vision. And even beyond a wish list of what we want things to be, but more of here's a prioritization, here's an implementation schedule, so that we can hold all of ourselves accountable for, this is what we went through this process, this is what we've come together as, and here's kind of how we're going to get that done. And that's really challenging, right? But, I think, being very open and upfront about that, and acknowledging that, hey, when we get this plan done, it's not the end. This is actually the beginning of actually getting the work done. But we've got to have this process set up to allow us to identify what we want, what our priorities are, so then we can move towards that implementation stage.
Yes, lots of talk about priorities and how we as a community sort of come together and decide on what those are. So speaking of, one of the other issues that I think this speaks about actually both to priorities, and then a number of you also brought up the issue of cost in being able to sort of make scalable progress on this. Mary Beth Eichert asked a question about sort of what percentage of federal dollars are going towards both safety projects and also particularly projects for bike and pedestrian infrastructure. And I'm going to tweak her question just a little bit to speak a little bit more towards an opportunity in front of us with Biden's infrastructure plan. He is I think the way that funds are currently allocated, we know across the country it's about 80% for roads and 20% for sustainable commute modes. And so as we sort of see progress on the American Jobs Plan, there is a line item, $20 billion for road safety. How do you think these dollars should be spent and allocated to communities? And I'm going to turn to Bill to kick us off on this question.
Put me on the hot seat quickly. I don't know if there's a particular formula that should be followed. And if you do, it really needs to set and be consistent with the policies that are established in any planning document. You'd hit on the planning issues before, and a lot of places, particularly smaller communities, have not done that. It's kind of in a passing. So those things need, just like a recreation plan, if you're going to get grants, you need to have some sort of prioritization list at the least, but certainly a plan that is somewhat cost feasible. It's kind of hard in addressing that question, to break out the actual funds that are being applied to either safety, bike ped safety, or bike ped facilities themselves. Oftentimes, what you're going to have is a redevelopment of a corridor. Let's take, in Nashville, that y'all are probably familiar with, the big project of beginning here is Highway 41A, Nolensville Pike, from Old Hickory Boulevard down towards Nolensville is going to be widened. So that roadway, yes, you'll have more vehicle capacity that's added there, but you're going to have bike and ped facilities as part of that. So trying to break that out and separate those costs from the actual roadway capacity dollars is somewhat hard to figure. I suppose there is probably some way to do that, but a lot of these capacity improvements, other than the interstate system, include bike ped improvements as well. And that's important to ensure that is, first of all, is included in the plans. I'd mentioned here before in our discussion about coordinating with TDOT to ensure that we have the proper improvements constructed when they redo some bridges here in town with the state funds that were approved a couple of years ago, gas tax funds. So it's imperative that those coordination efforts and those facilities be provided. And particular percentage is not really important. As we mentioned, that we essentially went 40, 50 years without any investment in noticeable investment in pedestrian and bike improvements. So we're never going to really be able to catch up in a short period of time. So it's not so much the percentage as it is the priorities, I think, is what we need to focus on.
Aaron, I apologize. I mean, I would say particular to state funding, and often I think half, I guess, the TDOT work plan is kind of federal dollars routed through. But I think from an advocacy perspective, kind of like what can we do to make this better, and going back to what I started saying about, funding, and as far behind as we are, I'm very optimistic about this administration and the focus that they are going to bring. But, we do have this sort of legacy disinvestment of, transit can't be successful if you can't walk to it. right? And so I think we've seen historically federal funding being for, I can't remember all the acronyms, but, Tiger and start this and start that, and so like a light rail corridor or I kind of call it like the shiny disco ball, it's just kind of like, oh, let's do this, this project. And it's not that project doesn't have merit, but again, just the kind of the foundational stuff. So I have seen a lot of kind of federal dollars, now I get a little worried, like electric cars, but like electric cars are still cars, and so it's always kind of like, what's the shiny new thing, rather than what is kind of the foundational work that needs to be done. So, I was looking back at TDOT's work plan for this last year, work program, $2.2 billion. 1.2 of those being, state specific, from the state budget, I guess $1 billion being a federal pass through. But our multimodal access grant program, previously 15 million, now 18 million, right? It's a great program. I commend it. It's got like a 95-5 or 90-10 kind of local match. But the maximum the state can contribute to any particular project is $950K. So round that up to $1 million. There's an $18 million, and like $1 million builds, a mile of sidewalk, right? And that whole multimodal program is stretched over the entire state of Tennessee. So a lot of what we need to do is to be getting up to the state and being engaged in the budget process, right? And so if you've got a $2.2 billion roadway budget and you have, you're 70 to 80 years behind on sidewalk infrastructure and like, we've got, I think, whether it's, municipal leagues or MPOs or, to kind of elevate that funding conversation. And that goes all the way up kind of to the federal level of making sure that they're funding, sidewalks, bikeways, like things that are just not as jazzy and big project, that are just kind of standard stuff.
Yeah, I think that is such a good point, and making up. No, we're not trying to blame TDOT for all of our problems, but I think the point is that we need to recognize this deficit that we have, and how do we sort of strategically address that. This came up when we were having the transit infrastructure conversation, because transit will likely be on so many of those pikes, and our per mile costs were much higher than so many of our peers because we had to incorporate so much of that foundational, whether it was from sidewalks, new traffic signals, even fiber along the corridors was being put into our per mile costs, which was making it more expensive. Nora and Robbie, anything to chime in on funding?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to what other people have said, there's lots of money out there, and if we were able to build an interstate highway system in 60 years for the entire country, it doesn't seem unreasonable that we can make it safe to cross our streets in all of our cities in the state and in the country. And so I'm really excited both about the Biden infrastructure plan, but also the federal, transportation program is also coming up for an update this fall, I think. So I think there's a lot of hope both for short-term changes in funding structures, but also long-term funding, particularly that prioritizes safety and prioritizes maintenance over adding lanes. And until we can, keep what we have today safe and, effective, then maybe we should hold off adding more lanes until we get to that point.
Yeah, I would just add to that, with the money at hand or the potential money at hand, I think there's a great opportunity to go in and retroactively make some improvements to create stronger linkages between our existing sidewalk and bike infrastructure to then create obviously a larger network there. From that, I think that helps raise the awareness and then helps, sell the case in a way to, hey, we really got some policy changes. We've got some criteria that we need to to work on so that, there's the opportunity for more funding to be allocated towards non-road widening or expansion type projects, which will help kind of lower the cost as you start having conversations around transit and other things like that. And then hopefully that gets us to a point where we just expect these improvements to be part of the infrastructure project and not the exception and not the trade-off. It's just like you would have roadway lanes, just like you'd have curb and gutter or shoulders, you would have this infrastructure as a part of it. And I know that that's something that TDOT is been very mindful of, and they're working towards getting to those solutions. But that can be scaled up or down. But that's where I'd like to see us, is that it's just expected that these improvements are part of any type of transportation networks, improvements, priorities, policies that we choose to make moving forward.
Thanks, Robbie. I'm going to turn to another audience question. Jason wants your thoughts on creating bike freeways for commutes into downtown areas. Nora, maybe you can kick us off on this one.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great, certainly, to have. I know there are a lot of struggles in connecting our counties by bike, and there's really no option for most people to bike between counties. So I know other countries have those. I would say, I think in my mind, the pedestrian, just being able to have a safe corridor for people to ride the bus would be a higher priority. Let's first make it safe for pedestrians, and then we can make sure that there's good bike connections. But yeah, I would love to be able to bike to Madison or to a different county nearby.
Well, and Nora, I think I agree that from a prioritization standpoint, but I think also too, like I serve a primarily, suburban area. And so often, when I have constituents talking to me about, we need sidewalks, I'm trying to explain to them the math of, half acre, acre, distance from here to there, like that, as far behind as we are, like the math doesn't work. So, I'm often speaking with, my satellite cities and things at the periphery about how, greenways, bikeways, whether it's share the road in certain low speed neighborhood contexts. I think that, the greenways, if designed wider, like I worry sometimes that, and I think we're already seeing that, we didn't make our greenways wide enough to start, because they were just a little thing here where people are strolling along. And now it goes, oh, this makes an important connection. People enjoy this. Oh, if you get on a bike, you can get there 3 or 4 times faster. Like this is working. And then now it's kind of like we don't have enough space. So I think out in more suburban, rural areas that the really separated kind of greenway infrastructure is possible because you have more land to work with, bigger yards, agricultural, rural. And I think, what I hear a lot from constituents, and I know have felt myself is, we all kind of go to some other cities and we actually choose to go there because, Hilton Head and others kind of come to mind because they have this totally separated bicycle infrastructure. It is low stress. You do it with your kids. You enjoy it. It's shady. You go from your hotel room and to go to the beach and the tennis and, and then you come back here and, you get in the Suburban and the minivan and, you're just in your tank driving around and not really thinking about how those two might be kind of connected. So I think there's a lot of potential in kind of some of that boundary area, like Mr. McCord's area, where it's, Williamson County, where it's getting a little more dense residential, you have school proximity. Maybe you're not getting on that pathway to go into downtown Nashville to work at your office tower. So I think, as we get a little more decentralized sometimes, I think it's important to have a core downtown hub, and that's going to be, and we know, I think Aaron, you maybe shared earlier, 85% of people coming into downtown are driving alone. But, a lot of people work in, Cool Springs, you're trying to get down to, I love seeing what's happening in kind of Franklin near the downtown. So I think there are, kind of centers that are in our kind of Middle Tennessee, Cumberland region that, kind of building out those kind of greenway or bikeway networks could be helpful and doable because there's kind of more land to work with.
And another one of my sort of favorite data tidbits, which is courtesy of my colleague Will Barber here at Vanderbilt University, is that we've done a lot of research identifying sort of what the average length of trips are across the country, and they are actually under. It's almost. I think it's 60 to 70% of trips are under 3 miles, regardless of where you live. And Nashville in particular, I think, is in the top 3 cities in the country in terms of higher percentage of those short trips. So whether you are in the urban core, you're in the more suburban parts of Davidson County, or even in Sumner County, we are making a lot of short trips that could be replaced by other modes. So there's a lot of opportunity for replacing those minivan trips. Another question from the audience, Eric wants to know a little bit about how we approach sort of heavily used and problem intersections. And he names a couple examples of these. Do we need to have studies to tell us what we need to do in these locations? And does TDOT have a collaborative list with cities that show which intersections are priorities? And I think I may start with Nora on this one, since Walk Bike has done so much work with their Impossible Crossings report.
Yeah, I mean, I think largely there have been a number of studies done about what streets are the most dangerous and where crashes are happening, particularly for pedestrians. Speaking here mostly about pedestrian crashes. TDOT has a list of the most, highest crash corridors in the state. The city of Nashville does. So I think we know where a lot of the streets are. And I think what we've kind of missed is then kind of the next step, the action. And so I think more studies have a role, and the city of Nashville is currently doing a Vision Zero action agenda to even further hone in on what intersections or corridors are the highest crash spots and how we can prioritize them. And I think some of them are complicated engineering challenges. And, if you have a street that was built for cars and it doesn't have a sidewalk, and, there's a big ditch somewhere along the road, like that is not being an engineer, I know that is a complicated, challenge that needs to be addressed. So I think the next step really is actually zeroing in. We know that Dickerson Pike is a really dangerous street. We need to really start to zero in on what are we actually going to do about it, and focus our studies more on let's develop a plan to fix it so that we can have that project ready to fund the moment funding becomes available. Because where the crashes are happening, we have a pretty good idea. I think the next step is, okay, what are we going to do about it? And what are we going to do about it, not just in 20 years, but what can we do about it next year? Because people are walking here right now.
And I think even sort of some dedicated funding for these intersection improvements so that it doesn't get sort of pulled away to other issues. And of course, another issue that happens all the time in Nashville is our misaligned intersections, which has been a very big challenge. Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of how you identify problem intersections in Gallatin and collaboration with TDOT on addressing those?
Sure. Of course, anything that's being considered on a state roadway that we're going to be using state or federal funding requires that collaboration with TDOT and or MPO. We, as I mentioned before, certainly are focusing on our priority listing of places, and sometimes those will not necessarily require federal funding, although we do want to try to explore that avenue as much as possible to reduce our share of the cost. But ultimately that's not always going to be the best opportunity. We do we have these schools and the parks and the other similar types of attractions which created priorities for us. We also have a adopted ADA transition plan which identified a lot of intersections throughout the city, not all, but a lot of them that are not built to code, and maybe they're not even accessible for some users. So we're using that as a priority, not only for transportation improvements, but a lot of other accessibility issues. And as I mentioned, gaps in our system, we're trying to fill those gaps where they're the obvious gaps where we don't foresee private interest being able to do that quickly. So yes, and of course, as I mentioned with the bridge projects, big bridge replacement projects, we definitely are trying to collaborate with TDOT and other entities, private entities as well, to ensure that we're getting these things constructed and or built in such a way that when we are ready to construct something, we're not having to go about spending even more money.
Great, thank you, Bill. It looks like we may have lost him for a second. Well, we are getting close to the end of our time, so I'm going to ask one more quick sort of popcorn question. So give us a quick 30-second answer. But Robbie, I'm going to kick it out. I'm going to start with you. What is the most common misconception you hear or see about walking and biking infrastructure and particularly safety issues?
I would say the mindset that roads and our traveling public is built around the automobile. I do think that that's changing, but I think there's just been decades and decades and decades of that mindset. And so I think that's a huge misconception to be thinking about the car first.
Angie?
I think people not realizing that the speed at which they go really does have a negative impact to kind of the walkability. I think I sense that people kind of, we've heard a little bit with our 25-mile-per-hour rollout, like, oh, it's just a number on a sign. But I think there's a little bit of a misconception now about how that is kind of a culture shift, and it really is important. I say this to citizens all the time. Driving the speed limit or 1 mile per hour under is really a gift to your neighbors. And your friends and your community, because if you will drive 24.5 miles per hour on your 25-mile-per-hour street, kids can bike to their friends' houses, seniors can walk where they need to go, and I think people don't realize the speed at which they themselves are going. That compound effect in the system is really negative for safety, and so that not speeding and following the thing on the white sign with the black number, it's the law, and that folks need to follow it, please. Thank you.
Bill, we lost you for a second, so I'll just reiterate the question. We're just asking a quick wrap-up question about what the most common misconception is when it comes to making our streets safer. People really need to realize that pedestrians and bicyclists have the right to use the roadway just as much as a motor vehicle operator does. And a lot of people don't get that. Maybe they missed that in the driver's manual. I don't know, but it seems to be a big issue that we have. Such a good point. I love that one. Nora?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think one that I will just add is that I think we also have the conception that we should design walking and biking infrastructure around people who want to bike and walk but aren't already doing it, or kind of really focus on the commuting professional. And I think the reality is we have a lot of people in Nashville who are already walking and biking every single day. We have a lot of people in Nashville who don't have cars, who can't drive, whether, for many different reasons. And we really need to start centering those people in our designing plans, because I promise you, if we make it great for the WeGo bus rider, it's going to be great for the rest of us in terms of, being able to walk and bike. So I think trying to think a little bit more broadly about who we're talking about and who we're thinking about when we talk about pedestrians and bike riders will help us get to our goal.
Great, thank you, Nora. That was a great one as well. And I'm going to take the liberty of answering this one as well as a wrap up. I love that Robbie started us off with sort of the car culture idea. Everybody loves their pickup trucks, but in reality, that's the only option for people to get around safely in many cases. And so people don't know any other options. Speaking to Angie's point about, we love to walk and bike when we travel to other places. We just don't do it when we're here. I wonder what the difference is. And then I think the other point is that policy actually does work. This semester, I had the opportunity to co-teach a course with my colleague Dan Work in the engineering department at Vanderbilt, and we called it The Future of Cities and Mobility. But we started with the history of urban planning, because so many policy and infrastructure and investment decisions were made in the past that led us to where we are today. And so the most important thing we need to do to create safer streets is to start changing those things so that we prioritize our most vulnerable road users and getting them to where they want to go safely. Thank you to all four of you for being here today. This was such a great discussion and a great panel, really wide range of expertise and experiences across creating safer streets. And thank you so much to Shelley and the Cumberland Region Tomorrow for putting this on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. Great job.